Sometimes a single moment can shatter a family's carefully constructed world. Sometimes it takes just one stumble, one cry, one desperate phone call to reveal truths that have been buried for years. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where perfection was the unspoken rule, where manicured lawns hid messy lives, and where silence was often mistaken for peace, three lives were about to collide in ways none of them could have imagined. Catherine had always prided herself on keeping everything together. Her house was spotless, her schedule perfectly organized, her emotions carefully controlled. George lived just 2 doors down, a man who had learned to mind his own business after decades of disappointments. Between them was little Emma, a 7-year-old whose innocent fall on the sidewalk would become the catalyst for revelations that would change all their lives forever. This is not a story about heroes or villains. This is about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments of truth. This is about the courage it takes to speak up, the weight of secrets carried too long, and the unexpected ways strangers can become family when the world falls apart. What happened that Tuesday afternoon would force each of them to confront who they really were beneath the masks they wore for the world. And it all began with a child's stumble and a neighbor's decision to finally break his silence. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Emma's small feet as she skipped down Maple Street, her pink backpack bouncing rhythmically against her shoulders. At 7 years old, she had mastered the art of avoiding the cracks in the sidewalk, a game that made the walk home from school feel like an adventure rather than a chore. Her dark hair caught the afternoon sunlight, and despite the bruise that was just beginning to fade on her left cheek, she hummed a melody she had learned in music class. Emma lived in house number 43, a modest 2-story home with blue shutters that had seen better days. The paint was peeling slightly around the edges, and the small front garden showed signs of neglect that stood out starkly against the perfectly maintained yards of her neighbors. But to Emma, it was home, and she had learned not to notice the things that others might find concerning. 2 houses down at number 39, George Martinez was tending to his roses when he heard the familiar sound of Emma's afternoon arrival. At 64, George had lived on Maple Street for over 20 years, long enough to watch children grow up, families move away, and new ones take their place. His own children lived across the country now, calling dutifully every Sunday, but rarely visiting. The loneliness had become a comfortable companion, and he had grown accustomed to observing life from his front porch rather than participating in it. George had noticed Emma when she and her mother Catherine moved in 3 years ago. At first, he had simply been aware of the new neighbors in the way that observant people are. But over time, his attention had sharpened into something closer to concern. There were things about the little girl that didn't sit right with him, though he had never been able to put his finger on exactly what troubled him. Emma had always been quieter than other children her age. She played alone in the backyard, spoke in whispers when she spoke at all, and carried herself with a careful awareness that seemed unusual for someone so young. George had initially attributed this to shyness, but as months turned into years, he began to notice patterns that made his stomach tighten with unease. There were the unexplained marks that appeared on Emma's arms and legs with troubling frequency. Catherine always had explanations ready when neighbors inquired about playground accidents or clumsiness, but George had raised 3 children of his own, and he knew the difference between the random bumps and bruises of childhood and something more deliberate. The marks on Emma were often too precise, too carefully placed, too consistent to be accidental. But it was more than the physical signs that concerned George. It was the way Emma flinched when adults raised their voices, even in laughter. It was how she apologized constantly, even when she had done nothing wrong. It was the way she seemed to shrink into herself when her mother appeared, as if trying to make herself invisible. Most troubling of all was the fear that flickered behind her eyes when she thought no one was looking. George had wrestled with his suspicions for months. In another era, neighbors looked out for one another without hesitation, but modern life had taught people to mind their own business. There were legal considerations, the possibility of being wrong, the fear of destroying relationships over misunderstandings. Catherine seemed like a devoted mother to anyone who observed her in public. She attended school events, volunteered for fundraisers, and always presented herself as caring and concerned. Yet something felt wrong to George, something he couldn't shake no matter how many times he told himself he was imagining things. His late wife Maria had always teased him about his intuition, calling it his superpower. She would have encouraged him to trust his instincts. But Maria had been gone for 5 years now, and George often second-guessed himself in ways he never had when she was alive. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, George was deadheading his prize-winning roses when he heard Emma's footsteps approaching. He glanced up from his work, offering her the gentle smile he always did, and was surprised when she stopped at his fence instead of continuing home. "Mr. Pete, George," Emma said quietly. her small fingers wrapping around the wooden slats of his fence. "Your roses are really pretty." George set down his gardening shears and moved closer to the fence. Up close, he could see that Emma had been crying recently, though she had clearly tried to hide it. Her eyes were slightly red, and there was a tension in her small shoulders that seemed too heavy for someone her age to carry. "Thank you, sweetheart," George said gently. "Would you like to see them up close?" "I was just about to water them." Emma glanced nervously toward her house, where the front door remained closed. "I don't think I should. Mama says I shouldn't bother the neighbors." "You're not bothering me at all," George assured her. "In fact, I enjoy the company. It gets pretty quiet around here." But for a moment, Emma seemed to consider this, but then she shook her head. "I should go inside. Mama will be wondering where I am." As she turned to leave, Emma caught her foot on an uneven section of sidewalk that had been pushed up by tree roots. George watched in slow motion as she stumbled forward, her small hands reaching out instinctively to break her fall. She hit the concrete hard, her knee taking the worst of the impact, and immediately began to cry. George was over the fence before he had time to think about it, his gardening forgotten as he knelt beside the injured child. Emma's knee was scraped and bleeding, her tights torn, and her backpack had spilled its contents across the sidewalk. "It's okay, sweetheart," George said softly, reaching for the tissues he always kept in his pocket. "Let me help you." But as he gently dabbed at the blood on Emma's knee, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. As her sleeve had rolled up during the fall, he could see clear finger-shaped bruises on her upper arm, dark purple marks that were clearly fresh. They were the kind of bruises that came from someone grabbing a child too hard, too angrily. Emma noticed his gaze and quickly pulled her sleeve down, her tears increasing. "Please don't tell," she whispered. "Please don't tell Mama you saw. She says good girls don't show their bruises to strangers." George felt something cold settle in his stomach. The way Emma spoke, the fear in her voice, the practiced way she hid the marks on her arm, all confirmed what he had suspected for so long. This wasn't clumsiness or playground accidents. This was abuse, and it was happening just 2 doors down from his own home. "Emma," George said carefully, his voice gentle but serious. "Has someone been hurting you?" The little girl's eyes went wide with panic.
No, I'm just clumsy."
"Mama says I'm the clumsiest girl in the whole world. I fall down a lot and bump into things. That's why I have bruises. That's what I'm supposed to say." The phrase, "that's what I'm supposed to say," hit George like a physical blow. No 7-year-old should have rehearsed responses about their injuries. No child should be coached on how to hide abuse. "Emma, listen to me," George said, keeping his voice calm despite the anger building inside him. "It's not okay for anyone to hurt you. Not ever. And if someone is hurting you, there are people who can help make it stop. But Mama says if I tell anyone, they'll take me away and put me in a scary place with mean people. She says no one would believe me anyway because I'm just a little kid and I lie sometimes." Emma's voice was barely a whisper now. "She says she only gets angry because she loves me and wants me to be better." George had heard these rationalizations before, the twisted logic that abusers use to maintain control over their victims, the threats about being taken away, the gaslighting about lying, the justification of violence as love. It made him sick to think of this innocent child being manipulated in such cruel ways. "Emma, that's not true," George said firmly. "There are lots of good people whose job it is to keep children safe, and I want you to know that I believe you, and I think you're a very brave and honest little girl." Before Emma could respond, the front door of house number 43 opened with a sharp bang that made both George and Emma jump. Catherine appeared on the front steps, her expression shifting from concern to anger as she took in the scene before her. "Emma Rose Johnson, get over here right now," Catherine called out, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made George's protective instincts flare. "What did I tell you about bothering the neighbors?" Emma scrambled to her feet despite her injured knee, hastily gathering her scattered school supplies. "I'm sorry, Mama. I fell down and Mr. George was just helping me." "I can see that," Catherine said, her tone suggesting that George's help was neither wanted nor appreciated. She walked briskly down the front path toward them, her heels clicking against the concrete. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Martinez, but Emma needs to learn to handle these things herself." George stood slowly, his knees protesting after kneeling on the hard sidewalk. At his full height, he had several inches on Catherine, and he used every one of them as he met her gaze directly. The child was hurt. Any decent person would have helped. "Of course," Catherine said, her smile not reaching her eyes, "but Emma tends to be dramatic about minor scrapes. Don't you, honey?" Emma nodded quickly, too quickly, her small hand unconsciously rubbing the sleeve that covered her bruises. "Yes, Mama. I was being dramatic. George felt his heart break a little more as he watched the child parrot what she had clearly been taught to say. The fear in Emma's eyes when she looked at her mother was unmistakable, and George knew he was witnessing the careful choreography of abuse and control. "Well, I should let you two get inside," George said carefully. "Emma, if you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." The message was clear to all three of them, and Catherine's expression hardened slightly. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Martinez, but Emma has everything she needs at home. Don't you, Emma?" "Yes, Mama," Emma whispered. George watched as Catherine took Emma's hand, perhaps a little too firmly, and led her toward their house. Just before they reached the front door, Emma turned back and gave him a small wave, her eyes full of a sadness that no child should ever have to carry. As their door closed behind them, George stood alone on the sidewalk, staring at the drops of blood from Emma's scraped knee that stained the concrete. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't continue to stand by and watch this happen. He couldn't let his fear of being wrong or causing trouble override his duty to protect a child who clearly needed help. George walked slowly back to his house, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. He thought about Maria and what she would have said about this situation. He thought about his own children and how he would want someone to intervene if they were in danger. Most of all, he thought about Emma's eyes, so full of fear and sadness, and her small voice saying, "That's what I'm supposed to say." That evening, George sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him and his phone within reach. He had looked up the number for Child Protective Services 3 times, but hadn't yet found the courage to dial. Making that call would set events in motion that he couldn't control or predict. It would bring scrutiny and investigation and possibly tear apart what might look like a normal family from the outside. But George knew that appearances could be deceiving, and he had seen enough evidence to confirm his worst suspicions. The bruises, the fear, the coached responses, the way Emma flinched and apologized and tried to make herself invisible, all painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. As he sat in the growing darkness of his kitchen, George thought about all the times he had noticed something wrong, but convinced himself it wasn't his place to intervene. All the moments when he had chosen silence over action, comfort over courage. He thought about how many more bruises Emma would accumulate, how much more damage would be done to her spirit if he continued to do nothing. Finally, with hands that shook slightly from age and emotion, George picked up the phone and dialed. As it rang, he pictured Emma's small face, her whispered plea of "please don't tell," and her automatic response about being clumsy. He thought about the finger-shaped bruises on her arm and the fear in her eyes when Catherine appeared. "Child Protective Services, this is Janet speaking. How can I help you?" George took a deep breath and found his voice. "I need to report suspected child abuse. There's a little girl who lives near me, and I believe she's being hurt by her mother." The words hung in the air like a bridge that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. George had made his choice, and there would be no going back. Whatever came next, he would face it knowing that he had finally found the courage to speak up for a child who couldn't speak for herself. As he began to provide details to the social worker on the other end of the line, George looked out his kitchen window toward house number 43, where Emma was somewhere inside, probably trying to be invisible and hoping that tomorrow would be better than today. He couldn't promise her that everything would be okay, but he could promise that she wouldn't have to face her fears alone anymore. The call to Child Protective Services was just the beginning. George knew that his simple act of speaking up would ripple outward in ways he couldn't predict, affecting not just Emma and Catherine, but himself as well. He had spent years as an observer of other people's lives, content to tend his garden and mind his own business. But sometimes he realized minding your own business meant recognizing that a child's safety was everyone's business. As he finished providing the information requested by the social worker, George felt a mixture of fear and relief washing over him. Fear about what he had set in motion, but relief that Emma's suffering had finally been acknowledged by someone with the power to help her. He had taken the first step in what would undoubtedly be a long and difficult journey, but it was a step toward hope, toward healing, toward giving one small girl a chance at the childhood she deserved. 3 days after George's phone call, a white sedan with government plates pulled up in front of house number 43 on Maple Street. From his kitchen window, George watched as 2 women in professional attire emerged from the car, their clipboards and badges identifying them as social workers. Sarah Chen had been working for Child Protective Services for 8 years, long enough to recognize the signs of abuse, but still young enough to feel the weight of each case personally. Her partner today was Maria Rodriguez, a veteran investigator with 23 years of experience, who had learned to balance empathy with the clinical detachment necessary to do this job effectively. They had reviewed George's report carefully, noting the detailed observations and the specific concerns he had raised, the description of finger-shaped bruises, the child's coached responses about injuries, and the pattern of fearful behavior all painted a concerning picture that warranted immediate investigation. Catherine answered the door after the third knock, her hair perfectly styled and her smile carefully arranged. She was wearing a crisp white blouse and navy slacks, the picture of a responsible working mother. Behind her, the house was immaculately clean, with fresh flowers on the entry table and the faint scent of vanilla candles in the air. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," Sarah said, showing her badge. "I'm Sarah Chen with Child Protective Services, and this is my colleague, Maria Rodriguez. We'd like to speak with you about your daughter, Emma." Catherine's smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Of course, please come in. Is there some kind of problem at school?" "Emma hasn't mentioned anything. We've received a report expressing concern about Emma's welfare," Maria said directly, watching Catherine's reaction carefully. "We'd like to ask you some questions and speak with Emma if she's available." "A report?" Catherine's voice carried just the right note of confused concern. "I can't imagine what kind of report. Emma is a happy, healthy child. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding." The social workers followed Catherine into the living room, taking note of their surroundings. The house was indeed spotless, almost unnaturally so. Every surface gleamed, every pillow was perfectly arranged, and there wasn't so much as a speck of dust visible anywhere. For a home with a 7-year-old child, it felt more like a showroom than a place where a family actually lived. "Is Emma at home today?" Sarah asked, settling into the chair Catherine indicated while Maria positioned herself with a clear view of both the front door and the hallway leading to the rest of the house. "She's in her room doing homework," Catherine replied. "But I'd prefer to understand what this is about before involving her. Children can be easily confused by official visits, and I wouldn't want her to be frightened unnecessarily." Maria nodded, though she made a note on her clipboard. In her experience, parents genuinely concerned about their children's welfare were usually eager to cooperate fully, not to control the narrative. "Mrs. Johnson, we understand this must be concerning for you. We've received a report suggesting that Emma may have unexplained injuries. Can you tell us about any recent accidents or injuries she's had?" Catherine's laugh was light and practiced. "Oh, Emma is incredibly clumsy. Always has been since she started walking. Just this week she fell on the sidewalk and scraped her knee quite badly. Our neighbor Mr. Martinez was kind enough to help her, though I'm afraid she may have exaggerated her injuries to get sympathy." "Are there other injuries we should be aware of?" Sarah asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "Well, she does bruise easily," Catherine said thoughtfully. "The pediatrician says some children just have sensitive skin. She bumps into things, falls off her bike. You know how active children can be. I've actually been thinking about signing her up for a coordination class to help with her balance." The explanation was smooth and reasonable, exactly the kind of response the social workers had heard countless times from parents who had rehearsed their stories. Maria exchanged a subtle glance with Sarah before continuing. "We'd like to examine Emma for any current injuries if you don't mind," Maria said. "It's standard procedure in these investigations."
Investigate? Catherine's voice sharpened slightly before she caught herself.
"I'm sorry, but I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. Who exactly made this report? I have a right to know who's been spreading false information about my family." "We can't disclose the identity of the person who made the report," Sarah explained. "But I want to assure you that we take all reports seriously, and our goal is simply to ensure Emma's safety and well-being." Catherine stood abruptly, smoothing down her blouse.
"Of course, I understand you have a job to do."
"Let me get Emma. But I hope you'll explain to whoever made this malicious report that they've wasted valuable resources that could have been used to help children who are actually in danger." As Catherine left the room, the social workers could hear her footsteps on the stairs, followed by a low conversation that they couldn't quite make out. When she returned several minutes later with Emma, both investigators noticed immediately that the child looked nervous and kept glancing at her mother for cues. Emma was wearing a long-sleeved shirt despite the warm afternoon, and her hair had been freshly brushed. She stood close to Catherine's side, her small hand wrapped around her mother's arm. "Emma, sweetheart," Sarah said gently, "we're from an office that helps make sure children are safe and happy. We just wanted to meet you and ask you a few questions. Is that okay?" Emma nodded silently, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Can you tell us about the fall you had this week?" Maria asked, keeping her voice warm and encouraging. "Your mom mentioned that you hurt your knee." "I tripped on the sidewalk," Emma said quietly, the words coming out in a rehearsed rhythm. "I'm very clumsy. The doctor says some kids just bruise easy." Sarah noticed that Emma's response echoed her mother's almost exactly, using phrases that seemed too advanced for a 7-year-old's natural vocabulary. That must have hurt when you fell. Do you have any other bruises or sore spots that we should know about?
Emma shook her head quickly, perhaps too quickly. No, just my knee.
I told you I'm clumsy. Emma, Maria said, crouching down to the child's eye level. Sometimes kids get hurt in ways that aren't accidents. If that ever happened to you, you could tell us about it. We're here to help keep you safe. The change in Emma's demeanor was immediate and telling. Her body went rigid, her breathing became shallow, and she pressed herself more firmly against Catherine's side. Nobody hurts me, she whispered. I just fall down a lot. Catherine's hand moved to Emma's shoulder, and the investigators noticed how the child flinched slightly at the contact. As you can see, Catherine said with a strained smile, Emma is fine. Perhaps we could wrap this up? I have a conference call for work in 20 minutes. We'd like to do a brief physical examination, Sarah said. Just to document Emma's current condition, it would help us close out this report more quickly. Catherine's grip on Emma's shoulder tightened almost imperceptibly. I really don't think that's necessary. Emma is a modest child, and I don't want to traumatize her with an unnecessary examination. If you truly have concerns, perhaps we could schedule something with her pediatrician? Maria stood up from her crouched position. Mrs. Johnson, I appreciate your concern for Emma's comfort, but the examination is part of our standard protocol. It can be done here with you present, or we can arrange for it to be conducted at our office. Catherine could cooperate now, or the investigation would escalate to a more formal level. After a long moment, she nodded reluctantly. Fine, but I want to be present for everything. The examination was conducted in Emma's bedroom, a space that told its own story. Unlike the rest of the house, which felt like a magazine spread, Emma's room had an eerie quality of excessive order. Her toys were arranged with military precision, her books organized by height, her bed made so tightly that it looked uncomfortable to sleep in. Sarah noticed that there were no signs of normal childhood messiness anywhere in the room. No clothes on the floor, no half-finished art projects, no evidence that a child actually played there. It felt more like a museum display than a living space. As Maria gently examined Emma for injuries, both social workers documented several concerning findings. Along with the healing scrape on Emma's knee, there were indeed finger-shaped bruises on her upper arms, just as George had reported. There were also older marks on her back and shoulders that suggested a pattern of physical discipline that went far beyond normal parental correction. Emma remained silent throughout the examination, her body tense and her eyes fixed on her mother's face. When Maria asked about each mark, Emma had ready explanations. The bruises on her arms came from falling off her bike. The marks on her back were from running into a door. Each explanation was delivered in the same rehearsed tone, and each was accompanied by a nervous glance at Catherine. Emma, Sarah said softly as they finished the examination, is there anything else you want to tell us? Anything at all? For just a moment, something flickered in Emma's eyes. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking her head. I'm just clumsy, she repeated. That's what I'm supposed to say. The phrase hung in the air like an admission. Catherine's face went pale, and she quickly moved to help Emma get dressed again. She means that's what the doctor told us to explain to people who worry about her bruises, Catherine said hurriedly. Dr. Peterson said it would help her feel less self-conscious, but the damage was done. Both investigators had heard the slip, had seen the fear in Emma's eyes, had witnessed the dynamic between mother and daughter that spoke volumes about the reality of their relationship. After they finished with Emma, the social workers spoke privately with Catherine in the living room while Emma was sent back to her room to finish her homework. The interview revealed more red flags. Catherine's stories about Emma's injuries were too detailed, too perfectly explained, too consistent across multiple incidents. When pressed about her parenting methods, Catherine became defensive and evasive. I believe in discipline, Catherine said when asked about how she handled Emma's behavior problems. My parents were very strict with me, and I turned out fine. Children today are too spoiled, too indulged. Emma needs structure and consequences to become a productive member of society. What kind of consequences do you use? Maria asked. Catherine's smile became strained. Timeouts mostly. Loss of privileges. Sometimes I have to raise my voice to get through to her, but what parent doesn't? Emma can be very stubborn when she wants to be. The interview continued for another hour, with Catherine's answers becoming increasingly inconsistent. She contradicted herself several times, grew agitated when asked to clarify discrepancies, and frequently returned to complaints about Emma's behavior and attitude. When the social workers finally prepared to leave, they made it clear that the investigation would continue. They scheduled a follow-up visit, requested medical records from Emma's pediatrician, and arranged to speak with Emma's teachers at school. Mrs. Doc Johnson, Sarah said as they stood at the front door, I want to emphasize that our only concern is Emma's well-being. If there are challenges in your family, there are resources available to help. Sometimes parenting can be overwhelming, and asking for support is a sign of strength, not weakness. Catherine's mask slipped just slightly, revealing a flash of anger before she regained control. Thank you for your concern, but we don't need any resources. Emma and I are doing just fine. After the social workers left, Catherine stood at her living room window, watching their car disappear down Maple Street. Her hands were shaking with rage, and her carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack. She knew exactly who had made that report, and she knew that her perfectly controlled world was starting to unravel. Meanwhile, 2 doors down, George had watched the entire visit from his own window. He saw the government car arrive, witnessed the long conversation at Catherine's front door, and observed the serious expressions on the investigators' faces as they finally left. He felt a mixture of relief and anxiety, knowing that he had set something in motion but uncertain about what would happen next. That evening, as darkness settled over Maple Street, George sat in his garden among his roses, thinking about the choice he had made and the chain of events he had started. Across the neighborhood, Emma lay in her too-tidy bedroom, staring at the ceiling and wondering what she had done wrong this time. And in the house between them, Catherine paced her perfect living room, planning her next move and calculating how to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond her grasp. The investigation had begun, but all 3 of them knew it was just the first act in a drama that would test their courage, challenge their assumptions, and ultimately determine whether one small girl would find the safety and protection she so desperately needed. The social workers drove back to their office in thoughtful silence. Both experienced enough to recognize the signs they had witnessed. Emma's case would require careful handling, thorough documentation, and a coordinated response from multiple agencies. They had seen enough to know that this child was in danger, but they also knew that proving abuse and protecting Emma would require more than just suspicions and observations. As they began the paperwork that would formally document their visit, Sarah and Maria both felt the weight of responsibility that came with their jobs. They held the child's future in their hands, and they would not rest until Emma was safe. The investigation was just beginning, but they were already building the case that would hopefully set one little girl free from a life of fear and pain. The aftermath of the social workers' visit settled over Maple Street like an invisible storm cloud. George had watched from his window as the white sedan pulled away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken consequences. He knew that by making that phone call, he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The careful distance he had maintained from his neighbors' lives had been shattered, replaced by an involvement that both terrified and compelled him. For the next several days, George found himself hyper-aware of every sound coming from house number 43. He listened for Emma's voice in the backyard, watched for her small figure walking to and from school, and found himself straining to hear any signs of distress. The ordinary sounds of domestic life that he had previously ignored now carried weight and meaning. On Friday afternoon, George was raking leaves in his front yard when he heard Emma's school bus rumbling down the street. He had timed his yard work carefully, wanting to see her safely home while maintaining the pretense of normal neighborhood activity. As Emma stepped off the bus, George noticed immediately that something was different about her demeanor. The little girl moved more slowly than usual, her shoulders hunched inward as if trying to protect herself from some invisible threat. Her school backpack looked heavier than it should, and she kept her head down as she walked, avoiding eye contact with anyone she might encounter. George continued raking, but positioned himself so that he could observe Emma's progress toward her house. As she reached her front gate, he saw her pause and look back in his direction. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and George felt his heart break at the expression of desperate sadness he saw in her small face. Emma raised her hand in a tiny wave, the gesture so tentative it was barely visible. George set down his rake and waved back, offering her the gentlest smile he could manage. For just an instant, Emma's expression lightened, as if his acknowledgement had reminded her that she wasn't entirely alone in the world. But the moment of connection was broken when Catherine's voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife. Emma Rose Johnson, get inside this house right now.
The little girl's body went rigid at the sound of her mother's voice.
She hurried through the front gate and up the path, her small feet nearly tripping in their haste to obey. George watched as the front door closed behind her with a firmness that somehow conveyed anger even from a distance. That evening, George called his daughter Rebecca in Seattle. She had always been the most perceptive of his 3 children, the one who inherited his ability to read people and situations. As they talked about her job in his garden and the ordinary details of their separate lives, George found himself working up the courage to tell her what he had done. "Dad, you sound different tonight," Rebecca said eventually. "Is everything okay?" George took a deep breath. staring out his kitchen window at the lights glowing in Catherine's house. "I've done something, Becky. Something that felt right but has me second-guessing myself." He told her about Emma, about the months of observations and growing concern, about the fall on the sidewalk and the finger-shaped bruises he had seen. He described making the call to Child Protective Services and the visit from the social workers that had followed. Rebecca listened without interruption, and George could hear her taking measured breaths as she processed what he was telling her. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Dad," she said finally, "do you remember when I was about Emma's age, and Tommy Rodriguez from down the street came to school with those marks on his neck?" George did remember. It had been nearly 30 years ago, but the memory was still vivid. Tommy had claimed he had been playing with a rope, but the marks looked suspicious to George and Maria. They had debated whether to say something to the school or Tommy's parents. "Their mother wanted to speak up," George continued the memory, "but I convinced her it wasn't our business. I said we might be wrong, that we could cause problems for a family over a misunderstanding. And 2 months later, Tommy ended up in the hospital with a concussion," Rebecca said quietly. "You've carried that guilt for 30 years, Dad. You've always wondered if you could have prevented it by speaking up sooner." George felt tears prick at his eyes. "I won't make that mistake again, Becky. I can't stand by and watch another child suffer when I have the power to help." "Then you did the right thing," Rebecca said firmly. "It takes courage to get involved, especially when you're not certain what the consequences will be. But that little girl needs someone to advocate for her, and it sounds like you're the only one who's been paying attention." After they hung up, George felt a renewed sense of determination. His daughter's support meant more to him than he could express, and her reminder about Tommy Rodriguez had reinforced his conviction that speaking up was the right choice, regardless of the personal cost. The weekend passed quietly, but Monday brought developments that would change everything. George was watering his roses in the early morning when he saw a police car turn onto Maple Street. His stomach tightened as he watched it slow down and pull into Catherine's driveway. 2 officers emerged from the patrol car, their expressions serious and professional. George recognized one of them as Officer Patricia Williams, a community liaison he had met at neighborhood watch meetings. She was accompanied by a younger male officer, whose nameplate read Chen. George watched as the officers approached Catherine's front door, noting the way they positioned themselves with clear sight lines and easy access to their vehicle. This wasn't a routine welfare check. Something significant had happened. Catherine answered the door after several persistent knocks, and even from his distance, George could see that she looked disheveled. Her usually perfect hair was uncombed, her clothes wrinkled, and her posture suggested someone who hadn't slept well. The conversation at the front door was brief but intense. George could see Catherine gesturing emphatically, her voice occasionally rising enough for him to catch fragments of words, though not their meaning. The officers remained calm but firm, and after several minutes, Catherine stepped aside to let them enter the house. George continued his watering routine, but his attention was entirely focused on the drama unfolding at house number 43. He found himself wondering where Emma was during all of this, hoping that she wasn't witnessing whatever confrontation was taking place inside. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, the officers emerged from the house with Catherine walking behind them. But what made George's heart stop was the sight of Emma being carried by Officer Williams. The little girl was clutching a small suitcase and looking around with wide, frightened eyes. George's first instinct was to rush over and demand to know what was happening, but he forced himself to stay put. Whatever was occurring was clearly part of an official process, and his interference could potentially make things worse for Emma. As they reached the police car, Emma suddenly spotted George across the yards. She struggled in Officer Williams' arms until the policewoman set her down safely. Emma broke free and ran toward George's fence, her small suitcase bouncing behind her. "Mr. P. George," Emma called out, tears streaming down her face. "They're taking me away. Mama said this would happen if I told." George met her at the fence, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "Emma, sweetheart, these are good people. They're going to make sure you're safe." "But I don't want to go," Emma sobbed. "I want to stay here with you. Please don't let them take me." Behind them, Catherine's voice rose sharply. "Emma, get away from him. He's the one who caused all this trouble. He's the reason our family is being torn apart." George felt a surge of anger at Catherine's words, but he kept his voice gentle as he spoke to Emma. "I know you're scared, sweetheart, but remember what I told you about there being good people whose job it is to keep children safe? These officers are some of those people." Officer Williams approached slowly, her manner calm and reassuring. "Emma, my name is Patricia, and I'm going to take you somewhere safe while we sort everything out." Would you like to bring anything special with you? Emma looked back toward the house, then at George, then at the kind-faced policewoman. Can Mr. Osmond, George, come with me? He's the only one who's ever been nice to me. George felt his throat close with emotion. I can't come with you right now, Emma, but I promise you that I'll make sure you're okay. Officer Patricia is going to take very good care of you. That's right, Officer Williams said gently. And Emma, when things get settled, maybe we can arrange for you to talk to Mr. George on the phone. Would you like that? Emma nodded through her tears, wiping her nose on her sleeve. She looked at George one more time, her small face full of trust and fear in equal measure. You promise you won't forget about me?
I promise, George said, his voice thick with emotion.
I will never, ever forget about you. As Officer Williams led Emma back to the police car, George caught sight of Catherine standing on her front steps. The mask of perfect motherhood had completely fallen away, revealing a woman whose carefully constructed world had collapsed around her. But instead of grief or remorse, George saw only rage in her expression. This isn't over, Catherine called out to George as the police car pulled away with Emma inside. You have no idea what you've started. George stood at his fence, watching until the patrol car disappeared around the corner. Only then did he realize that his hands were shaking and his cheeks were wet with tears. The little girl who had waved to him every day, who had admired his roses and accepted his kindness with such grateful surprise, was gone. He could only hope that wherever she was being taken, she would finally be safe. The rest of Monday passed in a surreal haze. George found himself unable to concentrate on anything, constantly looking toward house number 43 and expecting to see Emma's small figure in the yard or at the window. The silence from Catherine's house was complete. No music, no television, no sounds of normal domestic activity. It was as if the life had gone out of the place entirely. That evening, George's phone rang. He answered it to find Officer Williams on the other end of the line. Mr. Martinez, I wanted to thank you for your report to Child Protective Services, she said. Emma is safe now, and your observations were instrumental in building the case that allowed us to remove her from the home. How is she? George asked immediately. Is she okay? Is she frightened? She's with a very experienced foster family who specializes in helping children who have experienced trauma, Officer Williams explained. She was asking about you, actually. She wanted to make sure we thanked the nice man with the roses who tried to help her. George felt a wave of relief wash over him. Will I be able to see her? Or talk to her? That will depend on how the case proceeds, Officer Williams said carefully. But I can tell you that Emma specifically asked if she could write you a letter. If you're comfortable with that, we can arrange for supervised correspondence. Of course, George said without hesitation. Whatever she needs. After he hung up, George sat in his quiet kitchen and thought about the events of the past week. He had lived on Maple Street for 20 years, maintaining polite but distant relationships with his neighbors, content to observe life from the sidelines. But Emma had changed all that. Her courage in the face of abuse, her trust in his kindness, and her desperate need for protection had called forth something in George that he hadn't known he still possessed. He thought about Maria, about how proud she would have been of his decision to speak up. She had always believed that people had a responsibility to look out for one another, especially those who couldn't protect themselves. In helping Emma, George had honored not just his late wife's memory, but also the values they had tried to instill in their own children. The next morning brought another development. George was drinking his coffee and reading the newspaper when he saw Catherine loading suitcases into her car. She moved with sharp, angry motions, slamming the trunk and doors with unnecessary force. Within an hour, she had driven away, and George noticed that a for rent sign appeared in her front yard by the end of the week. The house that had been Emma's home, the place where she had suffered in silence for so long, stood empty now. George found himself both relieved and saddened by Catherine's departure. Relieved because it meant Emma would never have to return to that environment of fear and control, but saddened because justice felt incomplete when the perpetrator could simply disappear. 2 weeks later, George received his first letter from Emma. It was written in careful second-grade handwriting on paper decorated with flowers, and it contained words that both broke his heart and filled it with hope. Dear Mr. George, the letter began. Thank you for helping me. My new family is nice and they don't get mad when I spill things. They say I can have friends and make noise and be a regular kid. I miss your roses. Can you tell them I said hello? Love, Emma. George read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it in the photo album where he kept his most precious memories. That afternoon, he spent extra time tending to his roses, telling them about Emma's message, and promising to keep them beautiful until she could see them again. The social worker had explained to George that the legal process would take time, that there would be court hearings and evaluations and a long journey toward permanency for Emma. But what mattered most was that she was safe now, that she was learning what it felt like to be a child without fear, and that she knew there were people in the world who cared about her well-being. George's decision to speak up had not been easy, and the consequences had rippled through multiple lives in ways he was still discovering. But as he worked in his garden and thought about Emma's letter, he knew with absolute certainty that he had done the right thing. Sometimes being a good neighbor meant more than keeping your lawn tidy and your music at reasonable volumes. Sometimes it meant having the courage to step forward when a child needed protection, regardless of the personal cost. The roses bloomed more beautifully that season than they had in years, as if they too understood that they were growing in soil nourished by compassion and courage. And every time George tended them, he thought of Emma and the bright future that was finally possible because someone had chosen to speak when silence would have been easier. Katherine Johnson's world began to crumble the moment she saw that white sedan with government plates pull up in front of her house. For 3 years, she had maintained perfect control over every aspect of her life and Emma's. Every detail had been carefully orchestrated, from the spotless house to the rehearsed explanations for Emma's injuries. She had believed herself untouchable, confident that her facade of devoted motherhood would protect her from scrutiny. But now, as she drove away from Maple Street with her hastily packed belongings, Katherine felt the foundations of her carefully constructed reality shifting beneath her. The rage that had sustained her through the confrontation with the social workers and the police was beginning to give way to something far more dangerous: the gradual dissolution of the psychological barriers she had built to justify her behavior. Katherine took a room at a budget motel on the outskirts of town, a dreary place with stained carpets and thin walls that allowed her to hear every sound from the neighboring rooms. The contrast to her immaculate house was jarring, and she found herself unable to settle into the unfamiliar surroundings. She paced the small room obsessively, her mind racing between fury at George Martinez and desperate attempts to plan her next move. For the first few days after leaving Maple Street, Katherine maintained her internal narrative that she was the victim of a terrible misunderstanding. George was a lonely old man who had misinterpreted normal parental discipline. The social workers were incompetent bureaucrats who had overreacted to minor bruises that any active child might have. Emma was a manipulative little girl who had learned to play the victim to get attention. But as the days passed in the sterile isolation of the motel room, Katherine found it increasingly difficult to maintain these justifications. Without Emma to control, without the familiar routines of dominance and submission that had defined their relationship, Katherine was left alone with thoughts and memories she had spent years suppressing. The first crack in her psychological armor came when she tried to call her sister Linda in Phoenix. Katherine had planned to present herself as a wrongfully accused mother seeking support and perhaps a place to stay while she fought to regain custody of Emma. But when Linda answered the phone, her response was not what Katherine had expected. "Kathy? Oh my God, where are you? The police were here asking about you and Emma. They wanted to know about our childhood, about Mom and Dad. What the hell is going on?" Katherine felt a chill run through her. "What did you tell them?" "I told them the truth," Linda said, her voice tight with old pain. "I told them about how Mom used to lose it when we were kids. About the marks, the bruises, the way she'd make us lie about where they came from. Kathy, are you doing to Emma what Mom did to us?" The question hung in the air like an accusation that Katherine couldn't deflect. She had never allowed herself to make the connection explicitly, had never acknowledged the patterns that had shaped her own understanding of motherhood. But hearing Linda voice it so directly forced Katherine to confront truths she had buried beneath layers of rationalization. "That's completely different," Katherine said, but her voice lacked conviction even to herself. "I'm not like her. I'm teaching Emma discipline and respect. Mom was just angry and drunk half the time." "Kathy, listen to yourself," Linda pleaded. "You sound exactly like Mom did when the school called about my broken arm. Do you remember that? How she convinced herself that pushing me down the stairs was just teaching me to be more careful." Katherine hung up without saying goodbye, but Linda's words echoed in the empty motel room. For the first time in years, Katherine allowed herself to think about her own childhood, about the fear and pain that had shaped her understanding of love and family. She remembered the walking on eggshells, never knowing what might trigger their mother's rage. She remembered the careful lies told to teachers and neighbors, the constant vigilance required to keep the family's secrets safe. As night fell, Katherine found herself staring at her reflection in the motel room's dingy mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the perfectly composed mother who had lived on Maple Street. Her hair was unwashed and tangled, her clothes wrinkled from days of wearing them without change, her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and something she wasn't ready to name as grief. The second crack came when Katherine tried to eat dinner at a nearby diner. She had always prided herself on her self-control, her ability to maintain appearances even under pressure. But sitting alone in a booth, surrounded by families with children who laughed and chattered freely, Catherine found herself overwhelmed by an emotion she couldn't quite identify. At the table next to her, a mother was helping her young daughter with a coloring book, praising each crayon stroke with genuine delight. The little girl, perhaps 6 years old, spilled juice on the table and immediately tensed, waiting for anger or punishment. Instead, her mother simply smiled and said, "Oops, let's clean that up together," without any hint of frustration or disapproval. Catherine watched this interaction with a mixture of confusion and something that felt uncomfortably like longing. She tried to remember a time when Emma had spilled something without immediately apologizing in terror, when her daughter had shown her artwork with pride instead of fearful hope for approval. But the memories wouldn't come, because those moments had never existed in their relationship. The food on Catherine's plate grew cold as she continued to observe the family at the next table. The mother's patience seemed inexhaustible, her affection for her daughter evident in every gesture and word. When the little girl dropped her crayon under the table and crawled down to retrieve it, bumping her head slightly on the way back up, her mother simply checked for injury and offered comfort. There was no lecture about being careful, no punishment for clumsiness, no anger at the disruption to their meal. Catherine fled the diner before finishing her food, unable to bear the comparison between this stranger's effortless maternal warmth and her own rigid, fear-based approach to parenting. Back in the motel room, she found herself thinking about Emma in ways she had never allowed herself to before. The third and most devastating crack came when Catherine discovered Emma's hidden treasures. While unpacking her hastily gathered belongings, she found a small box that Emma must have somehow slipped into her suitcase during the chaos of departure. Inside were the fragments of a childhood that Catherine had never fully acknowledged. There were drawings that Emma had made but never shown her, colorful pictures of houses with smiling families, gardens full of flowers, and animals wearing human clothes. Each drawing was signed with Emma's careful printing and dated, creating a timeline of artistic expression that Catherine had been completely unaware of. The contrast between the joy and creativity evident in these secret artworks and the fearful, muted child Catherine lived with daily. At the bottom of the box was a small notebook where Emma had apparently been keeping a diary of sorts. The entries were short and written in the uncertain spelling of a young child, but their content hit Catherine like a physical blow. "Today, Mama was happy because I didn't spill anything at diner. I wished I could play loud like other kids, but Mama says good girls are quiet. Mr. Jorge smiled at me today. He has nice flowers. I wished Mama would smile like that. I tried to be extra good today, but Mama was still mad. Maybe tomorrow I will be better." Catherine read through months of entries, each one revealing a child desperately trying to earn love and approval that never came, walking through life in constant fear of making mistakes that would trigger anger and punishment. The Emma revealed in these pages was not the manipulative, attention-seeking child that Catherine had convinced herself she was raising, but a lonely little girl who believed that her mother's anger was her own fault. The most devastating entry was one of the last ones, dated just a week before the social worker's visit. She says, "I deserve it, but it still hurts. I don't understand why I can't be good enough. Mr. Jorge looks at me nice, and I think maybe he would be a nicer daddy. I wished he was my family instead." Catherine dropped the notebook as if it had burned her, but she couldn't unsee the words or unfeel their impact. For the first time, she was seeing herself through Emma's eyes, and the reflection was horrifying. She wasn't the devoted mother sacrificing everything for her child's well-being. She wasn't the strong disciplinarian preparing Emma for a harsh world. She was the source of terror in a small child's life. The reason Emma flinched at raised voices and apologized for simply existing. The breakdown, when it came, was complete and devastating. Catherine collapsed on the motel room's thin carpet, her body racked with sobs that seemed to come from someplace deep inside her, that had been locked away since her own childhood. The grief poured out of her in waves. Grief for the mother she had never had, for the childhood that had been stolen from her, and most painfully, for the childhood she had stolen from Emma. For hours, Catherine lay on that carpet, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what she had done. She saw clearly now the cycle that had shaped her life, the way her own mother's cruelty had twisted her understanding of love until she could only express it through control and punishment. She had become the very thing that had terrorized her own childhood, and she had justified it by telling herself it was love. The memories came flooding back, memories she had suppressed for decades. Her mother's hands leaving marks on her arms, the careful lies told to protect the family's reputation, the constant fear that shaped every decision and interaction. She remembered promising herself as a young girl that she would never be like her mother, that she would break the cycle of abuse that had defined their family. But somewhere along the way, that promise had been forgotten. The stress of single motherhood, the exhaustion of working multiple jobs, the isolation of moving to a new town where she knew no one, all had worn down her defenses until the patterns learned in childhood reasserted themselves. She had become her mother without even realizing it, passing on the same legacy of fear and pain to another generation. As dawn broke through the motel room's thin curtains, Catherine found herself thinking about George Martinez with something other than rage for the first time since this nightmare began. She tried to imagine what it had taken for him to make that phone call, what he must have observed and felt to overcome his natural reluctance to interfere in a neighbor's life. Catherine remembered the way Emma had always lingered at George's fence, the brightness that came into her daughter's eyes when the old man would smile and wave at her. She had dismissed it as Emma's neediness, her inappropriate attachment to strangers. But now she understood that George's simple kindness had been the only warmth in Emma's world, the only interaction not shadowed by fear and the possibility of punishment. The realization that a stranger had shown more genuine care for Emma's well-being than she had was almost unbearable. George had seen what Catherine had refused to acknowledge, that Emma was a child in danger who needed protection. He had acted on that knowledge despite the personal cost, while Catherine had been the source of the very danger he was trying to address. Over the following days, Catherine began to confront other uncomfortable truths about her relationship with Emma. She remembered the way Emma would shrink into herself when Catherine's voice rose, the careful way her daughter moved through their house as if trying not to disturb anything, the practiced apologies that came so quickly they seemed automatic. She thought about Emma's quietness, which Catherine had always attributed to shyness or thoughtfulness, and realized now that it was actually fear. Emma had learned that speaking up, expressing opinions, or showing too much personality could trigger unpredictable anger, so she had made herself small and invisible as a survival strategy. Catherine also began to understand how thoroughly she had isolated Emma from potential sources of help or support. She had discouraged friendships, limited Emma's interactions with teachers and other adults, and created an environment where Emma felt completely dependent on her approval. It had been a systematic campaign of control disguised as protection. The most difficult realization was that Emma's clumsiness had often been the result of hypervigilance and anxiety. Children who live in constant fear of making mistakes often become so nervous that they create the very accidents they're trying to avoid. Emma's bruises weren't just from physical abuse. They were also from the psychological abuse that had made her jumpy, distracted, and unable to move through the world with the natural confidence that healthy children possess. As the second week of her exile stretched into the third, Catherine found herself thinking obsessively about what Emma's life might be like now. Was she happy? Was she still afraid? Had she been able to sleep without nightmares? Catherine tried to imagine Emma laughing freely, playing without worry, expressing opinions without fear of retribution, and found that she couldn't picture it. The Emma she knew had been shaped so thoroughly by fear that Catherine couldn't envision her daughter any other way. The realization that Emma might actually be better off without her was perhaps the most devastating of all. Catherine had always told herself that everything she did was for Emma's good, that her daughter needed the structure and discipline that only a devoted mother could provide. But faced with the evidence of Emma's hidden emotional life, Catherine had to confront the possibility that her presence had been the source of trauma rather than security in her daughter's life. Late one night, alone in the motel room that had become her world, Catherine made a decision that surprised even her. She called the number for Child Protective Services that she had found in her hasty research about fighting for custody. But instead of demanding information about Emma or threatening legal action, she asked to speak with someone about voluntary relinquishment of parental rights. The conversation was difficult and emotionally devastating, but it also brought Catherine a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, she was making a decision based on Emma's well-being rather than her own need for control. She was choosing to let go of the child she had damaged rather than continuing to fight for the right to hurt her further. The paperwork would take time, and there would be court appearances and psychological evaluations. Catherine would have to face the full legal consequences of her actions, and she would have to live with the knowledge of what she had done to an innocent child who had deserved nothing but love and protection. But for the first time since leaving Maple Street, Catherine felt like she was moving towards something rather than just running away. She was finally ready to break the cycle that had shaped her family for generations, even if it meant losing the only family she had left. Emma deserved better than what Catherine could give her, and acknowledging the truth was both the hardest and most loving thing Catherine had ever done. 6 months after Emma was removed from house number 43 on Maple Street, the transformation in her life was so complete that even those who had known her before could hardly believe it was the same child. Emma now lived with the Hendersons, a foster family who specialized in helping children recover from trauma, and for the first time in her young life she was learning what it felt like to be truly safe. The Henderson house was everything that Catherine's pristine home had not been. It was comfortable rather than perfect, lived in rather than controlled, and filled with the natural chaos and warmth that comes from a family that prioritizes emotional well-being over appearances. There were toys scattered in the living room, art projects covering the refrigerator, and the gentle sound of laughter that drifted through the rooms like music. Margaret Henderson, a retired elementary school teacher, and her husband Paul, a former social worker, had been fostering children for over 15 years. They had seen countless children arrive at their door, carrying the invisible wounds of abuse and neglect, and they had developed an almost intuitive understanding of what each child needed to begin healing. When Emma first came to them, she had been so small and quiet that she seemed almost to disappear into the furniture. She apologized for everything, asked permission to use the bathroom, and ate her meals in terrified silence, as if waiting for some unknown punishment to fall. She flinched when doors closed too loudly and jumped at sudden movements. Her nervous system still primed for danger, even in the safest of environments. But Margaret and Paul had infinite patience, and they understood that healing would take time. They spoke to Emma in gentle voices, gave her choices whenever possible, and created predictable routines that helped her nervous system slowly learn to relax. They never raised their voices, never criticized her for accidents or mistakes, and gradually began to show her that adult anger was not an inevitable part of daily life. The first breakthrough came 3 weeks after Emma's arrival, when she accidentally knocked over a glass of juice at breakfast. She immediately burst into tears and began apologizing frantically, bracing herself for the explosion of anger that had always followed such incidents in the past. But instead of anger, Margaret simply smiled and handed Emma a paper towel. "Oops," Margaret said calmly. "Let's clean this up together. It happens to everyone." Emma stared at her foster mother with wide eyes, as if trying to process this radically different response to her mistake. "You're not mad at me?" "Of course not, sweetheart," Margaret replied. "It was just an accident. Accidents happen, and that's okay." That small moment marked the beginning of Emma's journey toward understanding that she was worthy of kindness and forgiveness, that her value as a person wasn't dependent on her ability to be perfect. Throughout this period of adjustment and healing, George Martinez had remained a constant presence in Emma's life, though their relationship had evolved beyond the careful waves exchanged over his fence on Maple Street. After Catherine's voluntary relinquishment of parental rights, the restrictions on Emma's communication had been relaxed, and she had been allowed to maintain contact with the neighbor who had quite literally saved her life. George visited Emma at the Henderson house every Saturday afternoon, a routine that had become the highlight of both their weeks. He would arrive with small gifts, usually flowers from his garden, or books about gardening that they could read together. These visits had become precious to both of them, representing the continuation of a bond that had been forged in the most difficult of circumstances. During one such visit, Emma had shyly asked George if she could call him Grandpa George, explaining that she had never had a grandfather and thought he might be willing to fill that role in her life. George had been so moved by the request that he had cried, thinking of his own grandchildren who lived so far away and this little girl who had chosen him as family. As spring arrived and Emma's first full season with the Hendersons began to unfold, the changes in her were remarkable. She had gained weight and grown taller, her hair had regained its natural shine, and most importantly, she had begun to smile and laugh with increasing frequency. The hypervigilance that had characterized her behavior was slowly being replaced by the natural curiosity and playfulness that should have been present all along. Emma was also thriving in her new school, where teachers who had been briefed on her background worked carefully to help her catch up academically, while also supporting her emotional development. Her previous school performance had been adequate but unremarkable, constrained by the anxiety and fear that had dominated her home life. But freed from that constant stress, Emma's natural intelligence began to flourish. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was amazed by Emma's creativity and artistic ability, talents that had been completely suppressed in her previous environment. Emma's artwork, once hidden away in secret boxes, now covered the refrigerator at the Henderson house and decorated the walls of her classroom. She drew pictures of flowers and gardens, happy families, and animals playing in the sunshine, her art reflecting the inner healing that was taking place. The relationship between Emma and Margaret Henderson had grown particularly strong. Margaret had become the mother figure that Emma had never had, someone who offered unconditional love and support without the threat of violence or rejection. Emma had begun calling her Mama Margaret, a title that Margaret treasured above all her professional accomplishments. One evening, as Margaret was tucking Emma into bed, The little girl asked a question that revealed how much progress she had made in understanding healthy relationships. "Mama Margaret, why didn't my first mama love me the way you do?" Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation was crucial to Emma's healing. "Sweetheart, your first mama was sick in her heart and her mind. When grown-ups are hurt like that, sometimes they hurt the people they love without meaning to. It wasn't because you weren't good enough or lovable. You were always perfect just the way you are. But why couldn't she get better? Why couldn't someone help her like they helped me?" "Sometimes grown-ups have to choose to get help," Margaret explained gently. "And sometimes they're too scared or too hurt to make that choice. It's very sad, but it's not something you could have fixed, no matter how good you were."
This conversation marked another milestone in Emma's healing journey.
She was beginning to understand that her mother's abuse had been about Catherine's problems, not about any failing on Emma's part. This realization was crucial to preventing Emma from carrying guilt and self-blame into her future relationships. Meanwhile, Catherine's story was unfolding along a different but parallel path of healing. After voluntarily relinquishing her parental rights, she had entered an intensive residential treatment program that specialized in helping adults who had perpetuated cycles of abuse. The program was demanding and emotionally brutal, requiring Catherine to confront not only her actions toward Emma, but also the childhood trauma that had shaped her into someone capable of hurting her own child. The therapy sessions were excruciating, forcing Catherine to relive her own abuse while simultaneously acknowledging the ways she had repeated those patterns with Emma. She had to sit with the full weight of her actions without the justifications and rationalizations that had protected her psyche for so long. Many nights, she cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by grief for the childhood she had stolen from Emma and the relationship they would never have. But slowly, painfully, Catherine began to change. She learned to identify the triggers that had led to her abusive behavior, developed healthier coping mechanisms for stress and frustration, and began to understand the difference between discipline and abuse. She participated in group therapy with other parents who had hurt their children, finding both solidarity and accountability in their shared experiences. Most importantly, Catherine began to develop genuine empathy for Emma's experience, something she had been unable to access while she was actively abusing her daughter. She wrote letters to Emma that she never sent, pouring out her remorse and her hopes for Emma's future happiness. These letters became part of her therapy, helping her process her guilt, while also demonstrating her growing understanding of the harm she'd caused. After 8 months in the residential program, Catherine transitioned to a halfway house, where she continued her therapy while slowly rebuilding her life. She found work as a cleaning lady, a job that provided structure and purpose while allowing her to remain in treatment. She attended group meetings twice a week and worked with a therapist individually to continue processing her trauma and her actions. Catherine had also made the difficult decision to maintain no contact with Emma, recognizing that her presence in her daughter's life would likely be re-traumatizing rather than healing. She received periodic updates through the social services system about Emma's progress, and she found both joy and heartbreak in learning about her daughter's recovery. The updates painted a picture of a child blossoming in ways that Catherine had never allowed. Emma was making friends, excelling in school, and developing interests and hobbies that had been impossible when she lived in constant fear. Catherine grieved for all the lost opportunities, all the moments of childhood joy that she had prevented. But she also felt grateful that Emma was finally experiencing the happiness and security that every child deserved. As Emma's first year with the Hendersons approached, the legal process of finalization began. Margaret and Paul had expressed their desire to adopt Emma, and all the necessary evaluations and home studies had been completed. The court date was set for a Tuesday morning in early autumn, exactly 1 year after George's fateful phone call to Child Protective Services. On the morning of the adoption hearing, Emma woke up early and spent extra time choosing her outfit. She selected a purple dress that Margaret had bought her, along with a small flower pin that George had given her as an early adoption gift. She wanted to look perfect for the day she would officially become Emma Henderson. George had been invited to attend the hearing, his role in Emma's rescue making him an important part of her extended family. As they sat in the courtroom waiting for their case to be called, Emma reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you for saving me, Grandpa George," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me be your grandpa," George replied, his eyes bright with unshed tears. When their case was called, the judge spoke directly to Emma, asking if she understood what adoption meant and if she was happy to become part of the Henderson family permanently. Emma stood up straight and answered in a clear, confident voice that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. "Yes, Your Honor. The Hendersons are my real family now, and I want to stay with them forever." The judge's gavel fell with a finality that marked the end of one